just one semifinal set to cover here, so we might as well just jump right in since I got to play in the other semifinal. And of course, this is between the 6 and 7 seeds in these playoffs, the Azerbe Chatots and the Hisuian Houndstones. And I don't see a whole lot of surprises on the board here. Both these teams are very comfortable with their main cores of Pokemon. On the Chatots side, we see that Bastrodon that has been a menace all season with Iron Defense, Body Press sets, and sometimes some fun and interesting coverage. Supported by Thwackey with Grassy Terrain and Fake Out support. Driftblim, possibly running a Grassy Seed, though we have seen it not do that some weeks, but it could be using that to boost its bulk, which is already pretty solid in this format, and activate on Burden. And then of course it can click things like Will-O-Wisp, Strength Sap, Tailwind. Brings a lot of support into the table, to the table, not into the table, that's not a saying. As well as that Ghost type offense and Flying type that can be valuable in some matchups. Then we have the Comfey, which can click a priority Floral Healing into Bastrodon or another teammate, but certainly Bastrodon is an option, thanks to Triage. And of course, with Grassy Terrain set up by Thwackey, the Floral Healing heals extra. Throw that on top of Bastrodon's enormous natural bulk, especially for this format, and the fact that it can Terrasilize to get rid of those nasty double weaknesses, and you have a Pokemon that is very hard to remove. Oh, there's also the Elekid able to click Follow Me. A Pokemon that can set up hard and is very difficult to remove here. A lot of it enabled by the Grassy Terrain set up by the Thwackey, and it actually looks like they might be committing harder to that mode in this matchup than usual, because I don't see the Passimian or the Floatzel right now. Usually they bring at least one of those Pokemon for basically burst damage. Bastrodon is a menace, but it requires a certain amount of setup and has to sit on the field for a certain amount of time. Passimian we've seen just throw off attacks and take KOs early, and often switching back and forth between those two tempos of play has been very beneficial to the Chatots throughout the season. And Floatzel can do that too, but Passimian is better at it. That doesn't mean that they don't have other offense. We've usually seen the Alchemy run something like a Life Orb set. It could set up with Calm Mind. It also can click Decorate into Bastrodon, but we've seen offensive Alchemy many times at this point. At this point, it's my first guess when I see the Pokemon, and it does, of course, complement Bastrodon nicely, and it has solid coverage into some of the... Well, it doesn't have amazing coverage into the Houndstones lineup, but what I mean is it helps deal with the Flamigo. That's really what I was going for there. The Comfey also could run an offensive set. It gets Priority Draining Kiss and Priority Giga Drain, and it can set up with Calm Mind, all of that being offset by it just not having the stats to do very much damage, especially since those attacks are not especially strong. I don't know if I have as much to say about the Houndstones, but speaking of switching up your tempo of play, we have seen this team many times over the course of the season bring probably Tailwind and Trick Room, certainly things that look like a Tailwind mode and a Trick Room mode, and switch back and forth on what it is that they're playing toward. At least not necessarily Tailwind. We haven't seen that often, but we have seen them bring fast attackers repeatedly throughout the season. Often there's something like Salazzle here to complement the Flamigo in that kind of mode, and it does look much like how I said the Chatots seem to be committing harder, at least at face value it looks like they're committing harder to the Bastrodon stuff than usual. It looks this week, this is a more specifically Trick Room coded Houndstones lineup than I'm used to seeing. They definitely could be doing some faster mode with like Indeedee and Flamigo, but the Flamigo is the only especially fast Pokemon here. I mean, Indeedee is kind of mid-speed, but then they have their size spam pieces with Indeedee, Bronzong, and Slowbro, so they can set up Psychic Terrain and throw off Expanding Force if they want. All of those can also set Trick Room. Piloswine is a bulky Trick Room attacker, nothing we haven't seen there before. They do have Gloom as a support Pokemon that can run an Eviolite. We saw Vileplume be kind of a menace for the Iridescent Terapagos after they picked it up in, I think, a late season trade. Gloom has more or less the same move pool. I'm not sure it gets all the same moves, but it might well get all the same support moves. Things like Strength Sap, Toxic, Sleep Powder, and no doubt more. But again, it also is able to run that Eviolite, and I could see it being here. Gloom actually looks like a pretty strong matchup piece here because it resists the Fighting Stab from the Passimian, it resists the Fairy Stabs from Alchemy and Comfey. It can certainly make Thwackey's life harder, double resisting its stab as well, but also it has offensive coverage potentially with its poison typing into Thwackey, Comfey, and Alchemy. And then with moves like Sleep Powder or even Toxic, it can make Bastrodon's life much more difficult. Of course, Bastrodon is immune to Toxic before it Terrasilizes, but Pokemon like Piloswine, Flamigo and Slowbro should be able to pressure Bastardon into terastallizing if this is a Bastardon-focused game plan, which is certainly what it looks like to me at preview. And that can create openings for Gloom to click that Toxic if that's what it's going for. But it also can just click Sleep Powder and give its teammates openings to land more attacks. So Gloom actually makes a lot of sense here as a matchup piece, and it's also, I think, a slow Pokemon. I don't know its speed stat, but I can't imagine it's very fast. So again, this looks like a fairly Trick Room focused team, though the Flamigo has been very powerful throughout the season and does give them a fast attacker to work with. And they could potentially, I think Flamigo gets Tailwind, I'm not 100% certain. If it does, if it doesn't, I'm sure Mario Man will let me know in the comments, which genuinely is appreciated. I don't mean that as in any other way. But even if it doesn't, it's a fast attacker that we've seen do a lot of damage and take KOs throughout the season. Game 1 getting started here. We see Bronzong leading with Flamigo against Thwackey and Drifblim. Again, I'm going to call out, I think I did last week, but something the Houndstones have done throughout the season, leading a fast attacker and a Trick Room setter. A good way to kind of keep the opponent off balance, I think. At least I feel like that's... I haven't actually played them, but I feel like that's how I would feel in that position, because they're still not committing hard on which way they go with it. And you immediately have two very different threats to deal with. Maybe you have a plan to shut one of them down. Very hard to shut both of them down. Of course, they also then, on the Houndstone side, have to make the right reads, but yeah, it's a very powerful starting position for them that they've been taking advantage of all throughout the season. On the other side, we see the Thwackey and Drifblim, so let me just see if a Grassy Seed activates. It does, so this will be Unburdened Drifblim, almost certainly. So it doubles its speed and gets a defense boost just off of this, and then it already has a massive amount of HP. And it can go for a Will-O-Wisp into Flamigo or something if it wants. Let's see. Flamigo actually just switching out to Indeedee, so the Psychic Terrain now is up. Bronzong, Thwackey goes for Fake Out, but this Bronzong is not running Levitate. So if it were running Levitate, it would be able to be faked out in Psychic Terrain, but it's not, so it can't. That's very helpful to the Houndstones if they went for Trick Room here. Drifblim throws a Psychic into the Flamigo slot. It hits Indeedee. It does very little damage, though it does get the special defense drop, and Bronzong does set the Trick Room. Next, we see a Heavy Slam into Drifblim, but look at that. That does not do very much after that Grassy Seed boost. Knockoff KOs the Indeedee, however, so Indeedee will not get a chance to throw off those boosted Expanding Forces. The Slowbro is, of course, a very strong Trick Room attacker, able to underspeed most Pokemon in the game and throw off Expanding Force. The Indeedee, not quite as slow. We see Drifblim going for a Calm Mind here, so it has now boosted both of its defenses. It's going to be that much harder to remove. I would not be surprised at all if it's running Strength Sap or something like that for a bit of recovery. And it could really potentially start to run away with this game. It's not a very comfy matchup for Flamigo. Flamigo can hit Drifblim with fighting type attacks if it's running Scrappy, which it probably is, but they're still resisted. You're still better off clicking that Brave Bird, or if you have a Dark type attack, there's that. But we've seen that the Drifblim has Psychic. I guess it probably doesn't have a Flying Stab attack if it has Psychic, but it could. We don't know two of its moves. I'm guessing one of them is Strength Sap or something like that. Yeah, it's obviously, if it can set up with Calm Mind and heal itself, it's hard to see how these two Pokemon remove it. Flamigo is kind of the only way, and Flamigo doesn't seem to me like it has the clearest path either. Slowbro will Terra Fire here. I mean, that Heavy Slam does about a quarter. Maybe I shouldn't sleep on it. Slowbro throws off a Terra Fire boosted Flamethrower into Thwackey. Doesn't quite get the KO, and a knockoff will remove Slowbro's Assault Vest. Drifblim still setting up that Calm Mind. It is getting worn down by the Heavy Slam. Oh, but it survives the Expanding Force at 1%. Yeah, okay, so the Chatots did let their Drifblim get a little bit low there, and credit to the Bronzong, it was doing, and even though I said that wasn't a lot of damage, it's not like it was a threat to one-shot or anything. It was doing enough damage that it was hard for the Drifblim to set up without putting itself in a risky position. However, the risk seems to pay off for the Chatot here. The Thwackey is knocked out, but the Drifblim at +2 special defense survives the Expanding Force at 1% and throws a Shadow Ball into the Bronzong and knocks it out. We've seen 3 of Drifblim's moves now. Flamigo comes in. There's still a turn of Trick Room. Comfey is here. Comfey can click Floral Healing into Drifblim. They might not need Strength Sap after all. In fact, they show us here that its last move is Protect. So Comfey can click that Floral Healing. It will first, however, chip the Flamigo with a Draining Kiss. And see, this is the problem with Comfey. It has that +3 priority on its, I think it's +3, on its healing moves. That does include attacks that also have a healing effect. Because Flamigo is a flying type, the priority attack works in the Psychic Terrain. But that was a stab, super effective priority attack, but it's just not doing very much damage. But the Comfey probably doesn't have to do that much damage here. It takes a lot from the Expanding Force. Flamigo goes for a bulk up, but the Trick Room will end here. Comfey can, I think, probably click a Floral Healing into Drifblim. No, Drifblim goes for a Psychic into Flamigo. It moved before Comfey, so Comfey did not go for Floral Healing. Flamigo will avoid the Psychic with a Protect. At side Pollen Puff into Drifblim. That's interesting. I didn't know this. Maybe I did know this, and I just forgot. So the side Pollen Puff is not affected by Triage. That must be because Pollen Puff is considered an attack by the game. I mean, that's consistent with a lot of the other Pollen Puff mechanics. Like, you can still... I think you can still click Pollen Puff always if you're taunted. I think it just behaves like an attack, but it happens to activate that healing effect if you click it into a teammate. So obviously if you clicked Pollen Puff into an opponent, it would not be priority boosted by Triage, but we see here that it's also not priority boosted by Triage into a teammate, even though in that situation it does have the effect of healing. So Flamigo actually had a chance to knock the Drifblim out there. It would have had to, if the Comfey had gone for an attack, the Flamigo would have had to take a lot of damage still. But it protects around the Draining Kiss, Psychic. Oh, the Drifblim has Unburden, right? So the Drifblim will go before the Flamigo. Yeah, well, because of these protects and detects throwing around, we can't see for sure, but I think that's the assumption here. So the Flamigo, never mind. It doesn't think it has a safe attack to throw off. I don't know, maybe you have to throw an attack off anyway just because that's your only out in what looks like a lost game. I don't know. Or maybe you protect the Flamigo and hope that you crit them with the Slowbro. Honestly, if that's what they're going for, I understand it, and I might well have gone for the same thing in the same position. That might be their best out here. In any case, the Flamigo didn't think it was safe to attack. Comfey having the slower Pollen Puff compared to a Floral Healing doesn't really matter here. It does get knocked out by the Expanding Force that is single target now because the Psychic Terrain is gone. We see Terra Psychic Bastardon, something the Chatots have brought before that is useful into these size spam opponents. Drifblim will get the KO on the Flamigo now. Takes that Scald from Slowbro pretty well, and Bastardon is now setting up that Iron Defense. So it is the same setup Bastardon that we've all learned to fear over the course of the season. But in Game 1, they're focusing more on the setup Drifblim, showing that they do have more modes here to work with than just the Bastardon stuff, even though the Passimian notably isn't there, and neither is the Floatzel. The Chatots take Game 1. The Houndstones were really kind of overwhelmed by this Drifblim after the Trick Room wore off, especially with the Comfey able to heal it, despite that whole thing I said about the priority. We're going to go to Game 2 now, and we're going to see what adjustments the Houndstones can come up with. I'm looking at that Gloom, but the Drifblim's attacks are Shadow Ball and Psychic. I don't really see the Gloom being all that helpful into that. Unless you just anticipate the Chatots to switch to a different game plan, trying to catch an adjustment because the Drifblim worked well. Maybe they think the opponent has something for that, they throw something else at them, like an actual Bastardon-focused game plan, or something with the Alchemy. Then the Gloom could make sense, but that sure is a risky thing to call here. In terms of shutting down the Drifblim game plan, I guess the Drifblim got by to an extent because the opponent's attacks under Trick Room were not that focused into it. Like, I think there were some moments where they attacked Drifblim's partner and just worked on wearing the Drifblim down, probably expecting the Drifblim to be knocked out by that Expanding Force that left it at 1%. But if it is the Drifblim game plan again, you can there's probably a way. I'm not saying it's easy, but there's probably a way that you can set Trick Room and just focus down harder on the Drifblim. And then the Gloom might make sense to cover for some other game plan that Chatots throw at them this time, but I don't know. I don't know what I would do in this position. I didn't draft this team and use it over 9 weeks of regular season and playoffs up to this point. They know their team better than I do. It looks like it is going to be a Trick Room lead, though. No Flamigo this time, so we see Bronzong and Piloswine against Thwacky and Drifblim. Drifblim will get that Grassy Seed again. Bronzong switching out, though. No Trick Room set up right now. Maybe prioritizing the Psychic Terrain. And, of course, these Pokemon certainly don't have Levitate, so they can't be faked out. Bronzong does avoid a Shadow Ball. Drifblim just going for that immediately instead of trying to set up this time. But Indeedee, of course, is immune. But Thwacky combos with a knockoff. That would be kind of a devastating double up into the Bronzong. And the Indeedee switching in, also a Psychic type. Because of the normal typing, it is immune to Ghost, but it still has a Dark weakness. So it takes a lot from knockoff, and we see it loses a focus sash there. It was never going to be KO'd by the knockoff, but probably just about anything else will KO it at this point. Pilus 1 just throwing an Icicle Crash into the +1 Drifblim. Let's see what that does. A fair bit, but probably less than they wanted. Indeedee will protect this turn, avoiding a Psychic from Drifblim as Pilus 1 gets his Eviolite knocked off. That's going to be a little bit awkward for Pilus 1's survivability over the rest of the game. Drifblim survives another Icicle Crash, but is now at just 3%, but it does not look like it's a set-up Drifblim game plan this time. It's had... Well, maybe I shouldn't say it's had openings to quick Calm Mind. The Pilus 1 is obviously doing more damage than the Bronzong did in Game 1, but it is just throwing off those attacks. Indeedee switching out here. Bronzong back in. Drifblim protects as Thwackey U-turns into the Bronzong, chips it a little bit, gets the Comfey in. On an Icicle Crash that crits and knocks Comfey down to 28% immediately before it's ever clicked a move. We see Terra Psychic Drifblim. Drifblim now... oh, they were probably scouting for Ice Shard on the Pilus 1 there, right? The Protect would have avoided a KO from that. But now also with the Terra Psychic, it might do something else here as well. I mean, now that you've seen Bronzong and Indeedee, you can probably anticipate that Psychic type attacks are coming out. Yeah, I think this does do two things. One, Drifblim is now no longer a flying type. That means it is affected by the Psychic terrain. That means if the Pilus 1 is hiding Ice Shard, it is not going to work on Drifblim this turn because it's a priority boosted attack. Second, the Comfey, even though we saw the Pollen Puff interaction last game, will be slower than both of these Pokemon, no doubt. Comfey is, I think, actually fairly fast, and Bronzong and Pilus 1 certainly are not. So it has a safe Pollen Puff and a Drifblim here. There's also no redirection or anything like that. The Pollen Puff is pretty much completely free. And Drifblim from there, obviously it's turned off its weakness to the Icicle Crash, but also it's going to resist Expanding Force now. And you've seen both Indeedee and Bronzong, so those Psychic type attacks are still an important part of the opponent's game plan. So I guess really this Terra does like 4 things in one. That's pretty cool. How often do you identify that in a position like this? Drifblim is protecting itself from Ice Shard. And okay, the Pollen Puff from Comfey isn't something that the Terra does. That's Comfey's own speed stat coming in handy. It complements... So the Terra does 3 things. It protects Drifblim from the Ice Shard, if there is one, and then after the Pollen Puff, Drifblim is no longer weak to Icicle Crash and resists Expanding Force. And that helps to deal with every Pokemon that we've seen so far from the Houndstones. It's also not Levitate Bronzong, so you know they're not going to be clicking Earthquake with the Pilus 1, though they could throw another Ground-type attack at you. You don't have to worry about Earthquake spam, most likely. Terra Fairy on the Bronzong. I do not have a whole elaborate spiel about what that does. I don't really know that it does all that much here, except turn off the weakness to Shadow Ball. That's probably what it's here to do. They might be going for the Trick Room setup here, actually. So kind of like last video, when in my own semifinal set, I was clicking Terra Dark Slowking every game to make sure that I could take hits from Rhydon and get the Trick Room set up. That's probably just what the Terra there on the Bronzong is for. Comfey does go for that Pollen Puff. Drifblim takes that Icicle Crash a fair bit better now. But Comfey is knocked out by a Heavy Slam, so there's no more Pollen Puff available anymore. But, okay, you know what? There is a 4th thing that the Terra did. The Drifblim now will get Grassy Terrain healing. There we go. Thwackey's back in. That is the last piece of the puzzle here. Pilus 1 switches out. Pilus 1, of course, does not have its Eviolite anymore. You might have forgotten because I've been talking a lot, but it was knocked off by the Thwackey earlier, so it really doesn't want to deal with a Woodhammer or a Grassy Glide or something. We do see that the Gloom is here. Again, Gloom is very strong into Thwackey. It could be very strong into the Pokemon in the back, almost certainly if it's Alchemy. Although Alchemy could run Psychic coverage, and it probably has some way to disrupt the Bastrodon, but Gloom has a lot of trouble dealing with the Drifblim, especially now that it's a Terra Psychic Drifblim, which we know has the move Psychic. And the Gloom is not able to Terastallize because the Bronzong already did. And we know... Actually, we know a lot here. The Gloom doesn't have the Eviolite because that was on Pilus 1, and it doesn't have the Focus Sash because that was on Indeedee. So I don't even know what Gloom's item is. If it's the Psychic Resist Berry, I don't even know the name of that one that they cooked crazy hard. But at face value, it looks like this Gloom is in incredible danger facing down. I didn't even think about that at preview. Pilus 1 and Gloom both badly want the Eviolite. I didn't even consider which one it was more likely to be on. We know now it was on Pilus 1. It looks like Gloom is in enormous danger against this Drifblim. And Thwacky can probably do good damage to Bronzong if it wants, but let's see. It actually throws a Grassy Glide into what was the Piloswine slot, now hitting Gloom, but Gloom is knocked out by a Drifblim. It's not running the Psychic Resist Berry. Maybe they don't remember its name either. I think more likely, whatever their game plan was, it just didn't account for something pretty niche, like Terra Psychic Drifblim. But we're not going to find out what Gloom's item is unless they let me know in the comments, or they sent their paste to the Discord, but I don't think they did. Anyway, the Trick Room is up now. Piloswine's back. I mean, if they have a way back into this game, it probably starts with that Trick Room, right? Drifblim will protect here because it's in some danger. It's still at fairly low HP, or at fairly low HP again after taking another Icicle Crash, even though it was no longer super effective. Thwacky going for the Grassy Glide because Piloswine, it needs the priority to go before Piloswine. Now the Trick Room is up. Piloswine takes a lot of damage, but it does survive. Heavy Slam into Drifblim, that would have done a lot, but there's a Protect. Icicle Crash knocks out Thwacky. So yeah, Thwacky might have wanted to get a KO with Woodhammer if it's running that. Knockoff U-turn, Grassy Glide. I can't remember whether we saw its last move. It might not be Woodhammer, but it'd be very... Oh, we did. It's Fake Out. Okay, it doesn't have Woodhammer. Never mind. Then it was just always clicking Grassy Glide there. But yeah, it does miss the KO. Thwacky gets knocked out back. Now Bastrodon is in. Bastrodon, of course, unable to Terrestrialize. Definitely threatened by a Ground-type attack from the Piloswine, which is slow. Which Pokemon is slower? Bastrodon has the lower base speed, so it can click Iron Defense. It can take advantage of the opponent's Trick Room to give it a better chance of surviving something like a high... I don't know if Piloswine gets high horsepower. I think it probably does. If that's what they want to go for here. The Drifblim seems a little awkwardly positioned too, because it's easily the fastest Pokemon on the field, and it's not at super high HP. Obviously, it's... Actually, the Bastrodon can just take the KO on the Piloswine, right? Because Piloswine's at 20%. There's no need for Iron Defense here. I was going to say the Piloswine is vulnerable to a Drifblim attack, but... Yeah, this slot is kind of pinned, actually. Bastrodon could just KO Piloswine, or it could just KO Indeedee switching in. There's no Terra available. They can protect, but then they still have the same issue on the next turn. Bronzong, I don't think, is able to take a KO here. The Heavy Slam doesn't do enough even to Drifblim, and it certainly won't to Bastrodon. So... Honestly, never mind a lot of what I said there. This position looks pretty favorable for the Chatots. I think the Bastrodon is perfectly set up here to take advantage of the opponent's Trick Room. It does go Body Press into Piloswine. Piloswine drops. Yeah, Drifblim takes the Heavy Slam. We know it does about a quarter. And Drifblim had kind of low HP, but more than that. Granted, Bronzong takes the Psychic okay, reasonably well. Drifblim is in Heavy Slam range, but... I mean, we might just see a Protect here. Does the Indeedee have... It does, okay. Indeedee and Drifblim both Protect. Yeah, Indeedee avoids a Body Press. The thing is, there is still a turn of Trick Room. Actually, there is still a turn of Trick Room. I was going to think about whether the Bronzong should actually reverse Trick Room there, anticipating that the Drifblim will Protect, but I don't think it makes a difference, because I think the Chatots have the slowest Pokemon and the fastest Pokemon on the field right now, and I think either one just knocks out Indeedee, so... I mean, the Bronzong is kind of just awkwardly positioned no matter what after that. Is the last turn of Trick Room. Indeedee actually gets a double Protect. Drifblim tries for one and doesn't get it. Drifblim will be knocked out here. Bastrodon is now on its own, but the only damage we've seen from the Bronzong is that Heavy Slam, and I don't think it's doing much to Bastrodon. That said, Trick Room is now over, so the Indeedee will be going first. That double Protect probably was the Houndstones out. Let's see if it works out for them. But we see an Expanding Force. It does just under a quarter to Bastrodon. That is not the damage you want here. Bronzong shows that it does have another attack, but it's Zen Headbutt. Yeah, maybe with... I mean, I don't know with what coverage. I don't think Indeedee gets a good coverage move for Bastrodon. Like, Shadow Ball would be neutral. But obviously it's not Terra Blast. The Indeedee can't Terrestrialize because Bronzong did. I'm looking for any kind of out I can find for the Houndstones. I feel like that if there was one, it started with that double Protect into Trick Room ending, but... Yeah, seeing that the Bronzong has Heavy Slam and Zen Headbutt, and now the Bastrodon takes a chance to set up with Iron Defense, and it has his leftovers. I'm not sure exactly what turn this game was lost, but I definitely think it is at this point for the Hisuian Houndstones. Shout out to them. They had an awesome season. It was a lot of fun to follow. They started... I always say they started with 3 consecutive losses, and I wonder whether I'm misremembering. I'm actually going to check the doc quickly. You won't be able to see it. Yeah, they did start the season 0-3, but it was a 2-1 loss every single time. In fact, this here is their first 2-0 loss of the entire season. And even watching back then, I remember saying, like, this team is kind of struggling, but they're competitive every single week. I don't think they're as bad as their record. I didn't word it exactly like that. I don't think I would in this content, but like, I think there could still be a threat here, and they proved it. They went on a heck of a hot streak, and then they got to 4-4 at the end of the season, and they had a really strong differential for being 4-4 because they were winning 2-0 or losing 1-2 every week. They were a menace throughout the season. Up and down in the win-loss column, but competitive every single week. Made it all the way to the semifinals. But this has just been a tough season for everyone. I mean, I've certainly been feeling it. I know a lot of these other coaches have. And congratulations to the Azure Bay Chatots on reaching, in what I think is their 3rd season in the PDL, reaching their first PDL final. Of course, I'll be seeing them there. And I have not started cooking for this matchup yet, so I better get to that once this is finished. Did I just talk for 26 minutes about one set? What am I doing here?